There is a moment, and almost every person on earth has experienced it, where you are sitting completely still, and yet something inside you is screaming. Not in pain exactly, not in fear. It's more like the sound of a door you haven't opened yet. A low, persistent hum. The feeling that your life is standing at the edge of something enormous, and you haven't moved toward it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That feeling has a name. Psychologists call it the gap. The distance between the person you are today and the person you sense you could become. And in the next 30 minutes, we are going to walk straight into that gap together. Not with empty promises, not with slogans, but with honesty, with stories, with the kind of understanding that actually changes something inside you, quietly, permanently, and for good. Before we go deeper, I want to say something to everyone watching. If you found this channel recently, I want you to know what we are building here together. We don't just teach English as a set of grammar rules or vocabulary lists. We believe that language grows best when it is attached to something real, to emotion, to ideas that matter, to stories that shake something loose inside you. Right now, as you listen, your brain is doing something remarkable. It is processing natural spoken English, rhythm, tone, vocabulary in context, sentence structure, and it is doing all of this while your emotions are engaged. That is the deepest kind of language learning, not memorization, but understanding. So stay with this. Every minute you listen, you are becoming a stronger, more fluent English speaker. And you might also come away with something that changes the way you see yourself. Let's begin. There was a man named Marcus who worked in a printing shop in a mid-sized city in Ohio. He was 34 years old. He had worked in that shop for 11 years. He knew every machine. He could fix any jam, calibrate any color, operate any piece of equipment in the building with his eyes closed. He was, by every measure, extremely good at his job. And he absolutely hated it. Not the work itself. He didn't mind the work. He hated the feeling that came over him every Sunday evening around 5 o'clock when he would look at the week ahead and feel a kind of heaviness settle into his chest, like a stone placed gently onto his lungs. Not unbearable, just heavy. What Marcus wanted, what he had always wanted, was to teach. He had known this since he was 19 years old, sitting in a college classroom, watching a professor explain something about the history of typography and thinking, I want to be on that side of the room. I want to be the one helping people understand things. But 19 became 22, became 25, became 34, and Marcus was still on the other side of the room. Not teaching, not even trying. And here is the question I want to sit with for a moment. Why? It would be easy to say Marcus was lazy. It would be simple and satisfying to look at his story and say, well, he just didn't want it badly enough. But that would be wrong. Laziness is not really the right word for what most people experience. Laziness is what we call it from the outside, when we can't see the full picture. What's happening on the inside is almost always something more complicated. For Marcus, the inside story went something like this. At 22, he had thought about going back to school. But school costs money, and he had rent, and the printing job paid well enough. So he told himself, next year. At 25, he had actually filled out an application for a teaching certification program. He remembered sitting at his kitchen table with the form in front of him, pen in hand. And then a thought arrived, quiet and specific. What if I'm not actually good at this? What if I get in front of a classroom and I'm terrible? What if I waste 2 years and money I don't have and I fail? He put the pen down. He told himself he would think about it more first. He never picked the pen back up. By 34, that unfiled application had become a kind of ghost. something he didn't talk about, something he had half convinced himself he no longer wanted. But the Sunday stone in his chest told a different story. What happened to Marcus happens to most people, and the mechanism behind it, the psychological engine that keeps people in their printing shops, in their comfortable but slowly suffocating lives, has a name. It's called anticipated regret. Anticipated regret is the fear of a future failure that hasn't happened yet. It is your brain trying to protect you, running simulations of all the ways something could go wrong, and using those simulations to convince you not to try. It feels like wisdom. It disguises itself as caution, as realism, as maturity. We tell ourselves we're being responsible. We tell ourselves we're thinking it through. But what we're actually doing is paying the price of failure in advance, without ever receiving the reward of trying. Think about that for a moment. Marcus spent 12 years suffering the cost of a failed teaching career, the disappointment, the wasted potential, the hollow feeling, without ever actually trying to become a teacher. He experienced all the loss with none of the attempt. That is what anticipated regret does. It charges you up front for something you never bought. Now here is where the story of Marcus takes a turn. And I want you to pay close attention, because this is the part that most people don't talk about. When Marcus was 36, 2 years after the point where we first met him, something happened that had nothing to do with a motivational video, nothing to do with a sudden burst of courage or a lightning bolt moment of inspiration. What happened was that his father died. His father was 67 years old, a quiet man, a man who had spent his whole life working at a factory in Pennsylvania, who had always talked about retiring to a small house near the water and writing the novel he had been carrying inside him since 1981. He never retired. He never wrote the novel. And at the funeral, standing beside his father's grave in the cold November air, Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not dramatically, not like a scene from a film, just a slow, quiet recognition, like a fog lifting. He realized that the Sunday stone in his chest was not just a feeling, it was information. It was his life telling him something true. The following spring, Marcus enrolled in a part-time teaching certification program at a community college 40 minutes from his home. He kept his job at the print shop. He went to class 2 evenings a week and all day Saturday. He was tired. He made less money for a while. Some weeks were genuinely hard. 2 years later, he stood in front of a classroom of 23 high school students and taught his first lesson on graphic design. He told me later, and this is the part I think about most. He told me that he had expected to feel proud. He had expected to feel relieved. What he didn't expect was how natural it felt. Like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. He said, I kept waiting for the moment when I would feel like I was pretending. But it never came. I just felt like myself. That phrase, I just felt like myself, is one of the most important things a human being can say. Because most of us go through large portions of our lives feeling like a slightly incorrect version of ourselves, doing things that are fine, that pay the bills, that don't cause problems, but that never quite fit the shape of who we actually are. And we get used to it. That's the dangerous part. We get used to the discomfort the way you get used to a noise in another room. Eventually, you stop hearing it. But it's still there. The question is, what does it take to stop accepting that noise? What does it take to actually go and find out what's making it? For Marcus, it took loss. It took grief. It took watching his father's unlived dreams go into the ground with him. But here is what I want to say clearly, and with everything I have, you do not have to wait for that. You don't need a funeral to wake up. You don't need a crisis. You don't need rock bottom. You need only one thing: A moment of honesty. A single question asked with genuine courage. What am I actually doing? And why? Let's talk about something that makes this question hard to answer. Psychologists have studied what they call the planning fallacy, our tendency to dramatically underestimate how long things will take and overestimate how much time we have left. In one famous study, students were asked how long it would take them to finish their senior thesis. The average prediction was 33 days. The average actual time was 55 days, nearly double. But here's the more interesting finding. When those same students were asked what typically happened to people's big projects, not their own, but other people's, they were quite accurate. They knew most big projects take longer than expected. We are wise about other people's time. We are almost completely blind about our own. And this isn't a character flaw. It is a feature of how the human mind works. We live in a permanent present. The future feels distant and elastic. The past is fixed and real. But the present, the now, always feels like there's more of it coming. Until, of course, there isn't. I want to introduce a second person now. Her name is Priya. Priya grew up in a household where success was defined very clearly. Good grades, a professional degree, a stable career in medicine or engineering or law. Anything else was not a real plan. It was a hobby, a dream, something for later when the serious business of life was handled. Priya was good at following the plan. She was genuinely intelligent. She worked hard. She became a corporate lawyer at 28. At 31, she started waking up at 3 in the morning. Not because of stress, or not only because of stress. She would lie in the dark and feel a strange, sourceless grief. She had everything she was supposed to want. And yet, what Priya had never been allowed to seriously consider was that she had a gift for writing. Not writing in the legal sense, not briefs and contracts and careful professional language. She had always been a storyteller. Even as a child, she wrote. She wrote notebooks full of characters and worlds and observations about people that were quietly extraordinary. Nobody had ever told her to stop. They just hadn't counted it as a real option. And so she hadn't either. Here is the thing that I find almost unbearable about Priya's story, and about so many stories like it. She wasn't missing anything. The talent was there. The desire was there. The hours were there. Not many, but some. What was missing was permission. And not permission from anyone else. Permission from herself. There is a concept in psychology called the internal locus of control. It describes the degree to which a person believes that their own choices, their own actions, their own decisions, rather than luck, fate, or other people, are responsible for what happens in their life. People with a strong internal locus of control tend to take more action. They face failure differently. They see setbacks as information rather than verdict. They believe, at the core level, that they have agency. That they are not passengers in their own lives. People with a weaker internal locus of control, and this is more common than we like to admit, tend to wait. They wait for circumstances to change. They wait for the right conditions. They wait for someone to recognize them, to give them access, to tell them it's their turn. Priya had spent 31 years waiting for permission. She was always in a position to give herself. Now, here is the part where I could tell you that Priya quit her law job and became a famous novelist, and everything worked out beautifully. But this is not that kind of story. What actually happened was smaller and I think more useful. Priya started writing again, not instead of lawyering, alongside it. She gave herself 45 minutes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and 2 hours on Sunday mornings. She didn't tell anyone, she just wrote. For the first 3 months, What she wrote was terrible. She knew it was terrible. She wrote it anyway because she had made a decision to stop waiting for quality before she had put in the quantity. In the writing world, there is a famous experiment. A pottery teacher divided his class into two groups. One group was told they would be graded on the quality of a single perfect pot. The other group was told they would be graded purely on quantity. The more pots they made, the higher the grade. At the end of the semester, all the best pots came from the quantity group, because they had spent the semester actually making things, learning from each attempt, getting better through doing, while the quality group sat theorizing about the perfect pot they hadn't made yet. Priya stopped waiting to write something good. She started writing, and slowly, not dramatically, not overnight, she got better. 2 years later, she published an essay in a literary magazine that received more reader responses than any piece they had run that year. 3 years after that, her first book. She is still a lawyer. She may always be, but she is also, now, unmistakably and irreversibly, a writer. So what do the stories of Marcus and Priya have in common? Not dramatic sacrifice, not radical life overhauls, not burning everything down and starting over. What they share is a quieter and more sustainable thing. They both reached a point where they stopped negotiating with themselves. That phrase deserves some time, because I think it's one of the most honest descriptions of how change actually works. Most of us spend enormous mental energy negotiating. We make deals with ourselves. I'll start Monday. I'll do it once things settle down. I'll try after this stressful period at work ends. I'll be ready when I feel more confident. I'll begin when I have more information. These negotiations feel reasonable. They feel mature. They feel like patience. But there is a difference between patience and stalling. Patience is waiting for something external to be ready. Stalling is waiting for something internal to arrive that can only be built through action. You cannot think your way into readiness. You can only act your way into it. Marcus did not become a teacher because he finally felt ready. He never felt fully ready. He enrolled because he decided that waiting to feel ready was itself a choice, and he was no longer willing to keep making it. Priya did not begin writing because she finally found confidence. She found confidence because she began writing. The action comes first. The feeling follows. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive truth about human change. We believe we need to feel ready before we begin. But readiness, almost always, is a product of beginning. Now let's go one layer deeper. Because understanding this intellectually is one thing, the harder question is, if this is true, if action creates readiness rather than the other way around, why is it so difficult to take that first step? The answer lives in something neuroscientists call the default mode network. It's a set of brain regions that become highly active when we're not focused on an external task, when we're daydreaming, when we're planning, when we're thinking about ourselves. The default mode network is where we rehearse conversations we haven't had, where we replay past mistakes, where we imagine futures that haven't happened yet, and where, crucially, anticipated regret does most of its work. In other words, the more we sit still and think, the more active this network becomes. And the more active it becomes, the more vivid and convincing our imagined failures feel. The antidote to a noisy default mode network is not more thinking. It is engagement. It is doing something specific enough that your attention is genuinely required. This is why people often find that once they start something, once they actually sit down and begin, the anxiety quiets. Not because the task got easier, but because the doing engages a different part of the brain, a part that is focused outward, on the task at hand, rather than inward on all the ways things could go wrong. The fear is loudest in the gap between decision and action. Once you begin, it gets quieter. Let's talk about comparison, because it is one of the most powerful and least examined forces keeping people stuck. We live in an era of extraordinary visibility. We can see, in real time, what other people are accomplishing. We can see their launches, their milestones, their accolades, their perfectly lit photographs of lives that appear to be going extraordinarily well. And our brains, which were never designed for this kind of constant social comparison, respond the way they were built to respond. They compare. Instinctively. Automatically. Without our permission. The problem is not comparison itself. Some comparison is useful. It shows us what's possible. It calibrates our sense of quality. It inspires. The problem is the specific kind of comparison we're most prone to making. We compare our interior life with other people's exterior performance. We see someone's finished product and measure it against our unfinished process. We see someone's public success and measure it against our private struggle. We see the destination and compare it to the fact that we haven't left home yet. This is not a fair comparison. It is not even a real comparison. It is comparing two fundamentally different things and finding ourselves lacking. There is a writer I admire who spoke about this in an interview. She said, "Comparison is the thief of the present moment, and the present moment is the only place where any work ever actually gets done." When Marcus started his teaching program, he spent the first few months comparing himself to the younger students in his cohort. They seemed faster, more confident, more naturally suited for it. He was older, more set in his ways, returning to a world he'd been away from for a long time. He told me there was a week in his second month when he seriously considered quitting, not because the work was too hard, because he had convinced himself that everyone else was so far ahead that the gap was unclosable, and then something shifted. He can't quite explain exactly what, but he said he made a decision to stop measuring himself against the other people in the room and start measuring himself against himself. Who was he at the beginning of this week compared to the end of it? What did he understand now that he hadn't understood before? That reorientation changed everything, because it gave him information he could actually use, and it made progress visible where before he could only see distance. This brings me to something that I think is underrated in conversations about change and growth: the power of small. We have a cultural obsession with transformation, with before and after, with the moment everything changed. And because we love these stories, because they are genuinely exciting and moving, we unconsciously build a model in our heads that suggests change must be dramatic to be real. But this is almost never how durable change actually works. Durable change, the kind that sticks, the kind that reshapes a life rather than just a moment, tends to be the result of small, consistent choices repeated over a very long period of time. There is a concept in physics called the flywheel. A flywheel is a massive, heavy wheel. Getting it to move at all requires enormous effort. The first push feels futile. The second push barely adds anything. The third, fourth, fifth, still barely visible progress. But keep pushing, consistently, in the same direction, and something happens. The flywheel begins to build momentum. And eventually, after what can feel like a very long time of pushing for very little visible result, it reaches a speed where it almost seems to move on its own. This is how most genuine progress works. The early stages are the hardest because you are exerting the most effort for the least visible result. This is exactly the phase when people give up, not because they're failing, but because they can't yet see that they're succeeding. Marcus taught for a full semester before he had a single class period that he would describe as great. He had many that were okay, some that were genuinely difficult. He kept showing up. Priya wrote for 6 months before she produced a single paragraph she was proud of. She kept writing. The flywheel turned slowly at first. Keep pushing. Now I want to address something directly, because everything we've discussed so far might feel like it applies to people with dreams, people who have something specific they want to do, a teaching career, a writing life, something they can name and point to. But what about the person who doesn't know what they want, who feels the Sunday stone in their chest, the low hum of something unexplored, but can't identify what it is or where it's pointing? This is more common than we acknowledge, and I think there is something important to say about it. Clarity is not a prerequisite for movement. We tend to believe that we need to know where we're going before we start walking. But this is actually the reverse of how most people find their direction. Clarity comes from engagement, from trying things, from paying attention to what makes you feel more alive and what makes you feel less, from noticing with genuine curiosity rather than judgment what kinds of problems you find interesting to sit with, what kinds of conversations make time disappear, what kinds of work leave you tired but satisfied rather than simply tired. You do not discover who you are by thinking about who you are. You discover who you are by moving through the world and noticing your own reactions to it. The person who doesn't know what they want needs to start somewhere, anywhere, not with certainty, but with curiosity, not with a destination, but with a direction. Take a class in something you've always been mildly interested in. Have the conversation you've been avoiding. Go to the place you've been curious about. Start the project that has no clear endpoint yet. You are not looking for a lightning bolt. You're looking for a signal. And signals can only be received when you're moving. Let me bring Marcus and Priya back one more time, because I want to end their stories in the right place. Neither of them has a perfect life. Marcus still has days when teaching is frustrating and hard. Priya still has stretches when the legal work drains her in ways the writing can't fully replenish. But neither of them wakes up anymore with that specific kind of grief, that hollow, purposeless ache of a life unlived. They both told me, in different conversations and different words, essentially the same thing. They said, I don't know exactly where I'm going. I don't have everything figured out. But I feel like I'm moving in the right direction. And that changes everything about how each day feels. That is the thing, not arrival, not completion, not the finished version of yourself standing on top of the mountain looking back at all you've accomplished. Just movement. Just the feeling of going in the right direction. That feeling is available to you, right now. Not after you figure everything out. Not once conditions improve, not when you're finally ready. It is available in the gap between who you are today and who you could be. The gap is not the problem. The gap is the place where your life actually happens. Walk into it. There's one final thing I want to say before we close. Somewhere in the space between beginning and arriving, you will encounter failure. Not might, will. Something you try won't work. A plan you made will break apart. An expectation you carried will not be met. And in those moments, the most important skill you can have is not resilience. Though resilience matters, it's not discipline. Though discipline matters too. The most important skill is the ability to be honest with yourself about what actually happened without collapsing into self-judgment. Failure is information. It is specific and useful and pointing at something real, but only if you look at it clearly rather than turning away from it in shame or drowning it in excuses. Marcus failed his first student teaching placement. He got a review that said he wasn't connecting with students the way he needed to. He sat with that for a week. It was painful. And then he went back to his cooperating teacher and asked, specifically and humbly, "What am I missing? What am I not seeing?" The answer changed how he taught for the rest of his career. Failure, when met with honesty, is the fastest path to growth available to us. The people who grow fastest are not the ones who fail least. They are the ones who extract the most learning from every failure they encounter. And now, before we end, a word about what it means to be here. If you have spent the last 30 minutes listening to this, you have been doing something meaningful on more than one level. You have been thinking, genuinely thinking, not scrolling, not half paying attention, but actually sitting with ideas about your own life and how you want to live it. And you have been practicing English. Not English as an exercise, not vocabulary drills or grammar tables, but English as a living language, full of nuance and emotion and real human complexity. The kind of English that exists in books and boardrooms and conversations that actually matter. At English Learning Studio, this is what we believe language learning should feel like. Not a task, an experience, not studying at life, living through it in another language. Every story we tell, every idea we explore, every moment of genuine engagement, that is language going deeper into you. Into your understanding, your intuition, your ability to think and feel and communicate in English in a way that is not just correct, but real. If you want more of this, stories that make you feel something, ideas that make you think differently, real spoken English that actually sounds the way the world sounds, then subscribe to this channel. Not because we asked you to, because you know what it feels like when something is worth staying with, and because the gap between who you are and who you could become. As an English speaker, as a thinker, as a human being alive in this particular and unrepeatable moment, is worth walking into.